The Draken Expanse had once been a minor trade corridor, a narrow stretch of space connecting two prosperous systems. Over time, however, political borders shifted, empires collapsed, and new hyperspace lanes rendered the route unnecessary. What remained was a region filled with the wreckage of forgotten conflicts, abandoned stations slowly crumbling in vacuum, and drifting debris fields that interfered with navigation systems. When piracy began to take root there, the major powers of the region quietly declared the Expanse a quarantine zone. Officially, no civilian or military vessel was permitted to enter. Unofficially, desperate captains still took the risk, gambling their lives on shorter routes and faster profits. The human warship Ares 7 was never meant to patrol such regions. Built nearly 3 decades earlier, the vessel belonged to an older generation of warships designed during an era when conflicts were slower, fleets were smaller, and battles were decided by disciplined formations rather than overwhelming technological superiority. Over the years, Ares 7 had been refitted and repaired countless times. New shield emitters were bolted onto an aging hull, outdated targeting systems were replaced with partially compatible modern interfaces, and entire internal compartments were redesigned to accommodate alien crew members as humanity's alliances expanded. The result was a ship that worked, but only because of constant maintenance and the experience of the crew who knew every sound, every vibration, and every flaw in its structure. Captain Elena Vale had served aboard Ares 7 for most of her career. She had joined as a junior officer when the ship still carried the scent of fresh alloys in its corridors. She had watched friends grow old aboard it, watched others transfer to newer vessels, and attended too many memorial services for those who never made it back from distant deployments. To her, Ares 7 was not merely a command. It was a living thing, a scarred veteran of conflicts that no longer made the history feeds. She knew its limitations better than any admiral reviewing reports from a distant capital world. On the day the distress signal was detected, Ares 7 was conducting a routine patrol along the outer boundary of the quarantine zone. The mission was simple: monitor long-range sensor activity, record any unusual energy signatures, and avoid direct engagement with hostile forces. The crew had grown accustomed to long periods of uneventful scanning broken only by routine drills and maintenance cycles. The quiet was heavy but familiar. The signal broke that routine. It was weak, fragmented by interference from the dense debris fields within the Expanse. Automated systems flagged it as a non-military emergency beacon, likely originating from a civilian vessel or convoy. Initial analysis suggested multiple overlapping distress calls, which implied that more than one ship was in trouble. Navigation plotted the source just inside the quarantined boundary. Protocol was clear. The Ares 7 was not authorized to enter the Expanse without direct orders from Fleet Command. Engaging unknown forces within a restricted zone risked political repercussions, potential ambush, and the loss of a valuable military asset. The ship's executive officer presented the relevant regulations, and the navigation team quietly waited for the inevitable order to log the signal and transmit it to higher command. Captain Vale did not give that order. Instead, she requested a detailed scan of the signal source. When the results came in, they showed multiple disabled civilian transports clustered together, their power signatures weak and unstable. More concerning were the energy readings surrounding them, signatures consistent with heavily armed vessels moving in coordinated formation. The patterns matched known slaver fleets that operated beyond the reach of formal law enforcement. The bridge fell silent as the implications became clear. If the Ares 7 turned away, the civilians would almost certainly be captured, transported to unknown markets, and scattered across distant systems. Fleet Command would eventually respond, but by then the slavers would be long gone. The quarantine existed precisely because response times in the region were unreliable. Captain Vale ordered the ship to alter course. The crew did not cheer or protest. They simply acknowledged the command and set to work. Those who had served long enough under her knew that such decisions were not made lightly. They also knew that once she committed to an action, she would see it through regardless of personal cost. As Ares 7 crossed into the Draken Expanse, the surrounding space grew visibly darker. Not in the sense of light, but in the absence of structure. Navigation buoys were long dead, their transponders silent. The scattered remains of derelict stations drifted slowly, sometimes colliding with smaller debris in silent impacts that sent clouds of particles spiraling outward. Sensor interference increased, forcing the crew to rely more heavily on manual plotting and visual confirmation. The first hostile contacts appeared as faint blips on the tactical display. Multiple warships of unfamiliar design, arranged in loose formations around the civilian cluster. Their hulls were larger than typical pirate craft, reinforced and bristling with weapon arrays. The configuration was not random. This was an organized operation. Before the Ares 7 could close the distance, a transmission cut through the bridge speakers. The signal was heavily encoded but translated automatically by the ship's systems. The message was brief, commanding the human vessel to power down and prepare for boarding. The tone was not threatening in the traditional sense. It was transactional, as though the outcome were already decided. Captain Vale did not respond. The Ares 7 advanced, weapon systems powering up as the targeting arrays locked onto the nearest hostile ships. The first volley was precise, aimed not at total destruction but at sensor clusters and propulsion nodes. 2 enemy escorts veered off course, their formations disrupted. In the confusion, several civilian transports attempted emergency power-ups, their engines straining as they prepared for short-range hyperspace jumps. The enemy response was immediate. Concentrated fire converged on the Ares 7, hammering its forward shields and sending shockwaves through the hull. Internal alarms sounded as damage reports streamed in from multiple decks. The ship's aging shield emitters struggled to redistribute power under sustained assault, and sections of the outer hull began to buckle. Yet the warship held position. What followed was not a battle in the traditional sense but a calculated delaying action. The Ares 7 maneuvered to place itself between the civilian cluster and the densest concentration of enemy ships, drawing fire while maintaining a narrow corridor through which the disabled transports could escape. The crew worked in coordinated silence, damage control teams sealing ruptures and rerouting power, while weapons officers fired controlled bursts to keep the slaver vessels at bay. As the engagement intensified, it became increasingly clear that the Ares 7 could not survive prolonged combat. The ship's systems were degrading faster than repairs could compensate. Internal fires spread through maintenance corridors, and life support in several compartments failed entirely, forcing emergency evacuations within the ship itself. It was in this context that the final decision was made, a choice rooted not in desperation but in calculated necessity. The sequence of events that followed would later be summarized in official records with technical language and neutral phrasing, but those who survived remembered it differently. The damage reports became a steady background noise on the bridge, each alert another small failure in a system that had already been pushed beyond its intended limits. Deck 9 lost gravity for several seconds before emergency clamps engaged. A coolant leak in the forward battery flooded a maintenance corridor with supercooled vapor, forcing 2 crew members to seal the bulkhead from the outside and reroute through the ship's narrower service shafts. The air smelled of scorched insulation and recycled oxygen, a familiar scent to anyone who had served aboard an aging warship under fire. Captain Elena Vale remained seated in the command chair, hands resting lightly on the armrests as she studied the tactical display. Her posture was steady, but the strain showed in the subtle tension of her shoulders. The Ares 7 had taken hits that would have crippled a newer ship with more sensitive systems, yet the older hull absorbed punishment with stubborn resilience. That durability, however, came at the cost of efficiency. Every maneuver drew heavily on reserves that could not be replenished in the middle of a firefight. On the main display, the civilian transports appeared as flickering icons, their engine signatures spiking erratically as they attempted to power up for emergency jumps. One transport failed to ignite its drive, its energy output collapsing back into silence. The slaver vessels began to converge on it, adjusting their formation to close the gap created by the Ares 7's interference. Weapons officers tracked the movement, waiting for firing solutions that would not endanger the transport. Targeting arrays are degrading, the weapons officer reported. We can still fire, but our accuracy is dropping. Prioritize anything that threatens the evacuation corridor, Captain Vale said. Ignore the rest. The bridge crew acknowledged the order without hesitation. They had already shifted into a different mindset, one that treated the ship not as an instrument of victory but as a barrier that could be worn down piece by piece to buy time. Each successful volley that forced an enemy ship to break formation translated into seconds gained for the civilians trying to escape. In engineering, Chief Engineer Torres coordinated damage control efforts with a precision born of long experience. The reactor core vibrated with increasing instability as power was rerouted repeatedly to compensate for failing systems. Torres monitored the fluctuations, knowing that the margins were shrinking. The ship's design tolerances allowed for brief overloads, but sustained stress on the core risked cascading failures that no amount of patchwork repairs could contain. "We're holding the core within safe parameters for now," Torres reported over the internal channel. "But if this continues, we'll reach a point where shutdown won't be possible." Captain Vale did not respond immediately. She knew what that meant. Once the core passed a certain threshold, the only way to control the release of energy would be to direct it outward in a controlled overload. The procedure was part of emergency doctrine, rarely used in practice because it meant sacrificing the ship entirely. It was a last resort, meant to deny the enemy capture of critical technology or to destroy assets that could not be evacuated. On the lower decks, the crew moved with quiet urgency. Medical teams converted storage bays into triage stations for wounded civilians brought aboard from disabled transports. The refugees came from multiple species, some injured by decompression, others suffering from shock after hours spent drifting in powerless hulls while hostile ships closed in around them. Language barriers were bridged by automated translators, but fear needed no translation. The presence of armed human marines guiding them toward evacuation pods offered little comfort, yet it was better than the alternative they had narrowly avoided. A young navigation officer paused to help an elderly alien woman into a pod, steadying her as the artificial gravity fluctuated. The woman's eyes reflected the flickering emergency lights as she looked back at the warship's interior, perhaps sensing that she was leaving behind more than just a temporary refuge. The officer offered a brief reassurance before sealing the hatch, knowing that the words were inadequate but necessary. As more pods launched, the enemy fleet intensified its efforts to close the corridor. Coordinated volleys battered the Ares 7's forward sections, forcing the ship to angle its damaged hull to keep the most vulnerable compartments shielded. The maneuver exposed secondary armor plates that had not been replaced in years, and several buckled under the impact. Atmosphere vented into space in narrow jets, and emergency bulkheads slammed shut to contain the loss. On the bridge, the first officer tracked the diminishing structural integrity readings. "We're losing compartments faster than we can isolate them," he said quietly. "If they breach the reactor section." "They won't," Captain Vale replied. The certainty in her voice was not a prediction of success but a statement of intent. She adjusted the ship's orientation again, placing the thickest remaining armor between the reactor and the nearest enemy dreadnought. The slaver fleet's flagship moved closer, its massive frame emerging from behind a cloud of debris. Its weapons charged in unison, the glow of accumulated energy visible even at a distance. The flagship's commander transmitted another message, this time offering terms of surrender in exchange for the warship's deactivation. The implication was clear. The civilians could be spared if the Ares 7 stood down. Captain Vale muted the channel. The offer, such as it was, changed nothing. The evacuation corridor was still open, and several civilian ships were preparing to jump. To surrender now would collapse the fragile window of opportunity the warship had created. The enemy would regain control of the engagement, and the remaining transports would be taken. The calculus was brutal but simple. The next exchange of fire pushed the Ares 7 past a critical threshold. A direct hit to the dorsal hull sent a shockwave through the ship's frame, knocking several bridge officers off their feet. Consoles sparked, and one display went dark entirely. The reactor's output fluctuated sharply, triggering alarms that echoed through engineering and command decks alike. Torres's voice came through the channel, tight with controlled urgency. "Captain, the core is becoming unstable. We can keep it contained for a short time, but we're approaching a point of no return." Captain Vale closed her eyes for a brief moment. When she opened them, the tactical display showed the last of the civilian transports aligning for their hyperspace jump. The corridor was narrower now, but still open. The enemy fleet was regrouping, preparing a coordinated push that would likely overwhelm the warship's remaining defenses. "Begin evacuation of remaining crew," she said. "Priority to medical and engineering. Once the pods are clear, initiate Protocol Theta." The bridge went silent as the meaning of the order settled in. Protocol Theta was not discussed in casual conversation. It existed in training manuals and contingency simulations, always framed as a theoretical measure. To invoke it was to accept the loss of the ship and anyone who remained aboard to execute the final sequence. The first officer hesitated only a fraction of a second before acknowledging the command. "Understood, Captain." Crew members began to move with renewed urgency, some casting brief glances at the command chair as they passed. No one spoke. There were no dramatic farewells, no grand speeches. The evacuation procedures were familiar, drilled into muscle memory through years of preparation for worst-case scenarios that most hoped would never come. Captain Vale remained on the bridge as the last of the crew departed, monitoring the tactical situation and adjusting the ship's position to maintain the evacuation corridor for as long as possible. With each pod launch, the warship grew quieter, the hum of human presence replaced by the constant vibration of overworked machinery and the distant thunder of impacts against the hull. When the final pod cleared the launch bay, the internal channel fell silent. Captain Vale transmitted a brief status update to the evacuation craft, confirming that they had a clear path to jump. She then turned her attention inward, to the ship she had commanded for so many years. The Ares 7 systems flickered around her, some displays failing entirely as power was rerouted toward the reactor core. The sequence that followed would later be reconstructed from fragmented data logs and the testimony of those who had escaped. The human warship Ares 7 entered the quarantine Draken expanse after detecting a distress signal coming from a cluster of disabled civilian transports that were being surrounded by slaver fleets. And although the region had long been abandoned by major powers, Captain Elena Vale chose to proceed with the mission knowing the ship was outdated and heavily outnumbered, and as the warship emerged from hyperspace it found shattered stations, burning cargo vessels, and prisoners being collected by massive alien dreadnoughts, after which communication attempts by the enemy to force surrender were ignored and the Ares 7 opened fire to create a safe corridor for the trapped civilians to escape, taking heavy damage in the process as enemy cruisers struck its hull and systems began to fail, with crew members fighting fires and sealing breaches throughout the ship while evacuation pods were launched carrying rescued survivors and wounded personnel, and when the tactical situation made it clear that the enemy fleet would soon overwhelm the remaining defenses, the captain ordered the crew to abandon ship while the chief engineer prepared the reactor for overload, understanding that the resulting explosion would cripple the surrounding slaver fleet. And after confirming that the evacuation craft had cleared the system, Captain Vale remained on the bridge alone and initiated the overload sequence, causing the warship to detonate in a massive burst of energy that destroyed multiple enemy vessels and broke the encirclement, allowing the remaining civilian ships to escape the sector safely. And in the aftermath, the incident was recorded as the loss of the Ares 7, while among the survivors the ship and its captain were remembered not as casualties of war but as the reason they were still alive. The moment before the overload, the bridge was filled with a harsh white glow as energy surged through conduits never meant to carry such a load. Captain Vale's final actions were unrecorded, lost in the flood of radiation and data corruption that followed. The explosion itself was brief, a contained release that tore through the clustered enemy formation and left drifting wreckage in its wake. Far from the blast, the evacuation pods vanished into hyperspace, carrying with them the survivors who would one day speak of the warship that held the line when nothing else stood between them and capture.